Let's go to Canberra now and catch up with Liberal Senator for Victoria, James Paterson. Thanks for joining us, James. We're keen to talk to you about China and global issues. But first up, your home state. You must be so concerned seeing this unnecessary lockdown that's been in place there over the last 2 weeks. But Acting Premier James Merlino now seems to be saying that until the majority of the population is vaccinated and he has some gold standard new quarantine facility that he wants, then lockdowns could happen again.
Chris, as you noted, I'm here in Canberra and it's not actually a sitting week. I'm a refugee from Victoria in Canberra and I've never been so happy to be in Canberra as I am this week because I went through the long lockdown last year with most Victorians and I'm very concerned about what I'm hearing from my constituents about the impact of this latest lockdown on them, that it is reviving the memories they had of the terrible experience they had last year. I agree with some of the comments you made in your editorial about the way in which the Victorian government has ramped up the fear about this outbreak, the way in which they've used alarmist and inflammatory language, for example, comparing this outbreak to measles with no scientific justification for that. And I'm also concerned that the Acting Premier said today that we need to reach very, very high levels of vaccination before we can ease off. As you pointed out, young, healthy people are largely not in danger of serious side effects or harm from COVID-19. It is the frail and the elderly and those with comorbidities who are potentially at risk. And so once all of those people have been offered and made available the vaccine, whether they choose to take it or not, then I think we have to reassess our approach to lockdowns. I don't think that lockdowns are justified when the risk of hospitalisation and complications and death from COVID are massively reduced, as we've seen from the United Kingdom, for example, where those priority exposed groups have been vaccinated. And although there is COVID circulating, there is very little hospitalisation and even less death.
I think you're right, and I think we're very close to that point now. We're very close to the point where everybody over 70 at least has had the chance to get the vaccine. Some people refuse. That's their right. Anyway, let's leave that now and get to these international matters as Scott Morrison heads to the UK for the G7. A very powerful speech from the Prime Minister yesterday and words coming out from the other G7 countries really talking about the importance of liberal democracies, pushing back against authoritarian regimes, say, like China. And we've already got a strong response from China. Let's have a listen now to the spokesperson for the Chinese Foreign Ministry.
China firmly rejects Japan and Australia's efforts to play up the so-called China threat and wantonly smear and attack China and interfere in China's internal affairs. We are determined to defend national sovereignty, security and development interests.
Yeah, so portraying Australia and Japan as meddling in their affairs and being aggressive, what do you make of all this, especially on the eve of the G7 meetings?
Well, Chris, you're right to mention the Prime Minister's speech in Perth yesterday. I thought it was a very sober and honest speech, but it was a very measured speech as well. And the joint communique issued by our Defence and Foreign Affairs Ministers between Australia and Japan today continues in that theme. And no country should be threatened or alarmed or concerned by the content of that statement or the Prime Minister's speech. What the thread that you can draw between both of them is that we are here for the rules-based order, that we are here to protect the rights and the sovereignty of states throughout the Indo-Pacific, and that we are opposed to people who are trying to change that order, undermine that order for their own interests. Now, no country should object to that, and certainly no country should be concerned that impinges on their sovereignty or their development or their political system. For example, I was very pleased to see the Japanese joining with us to condemn economic coercion. As an article in the Channel 9 papers pointed out today, now the largest economy in the world, the United States, and the third largest economy in the world, Japan, have called out what has been happening against Australia, perpetuated by the second largest economy in the world. That's a very pleasing thing for Australia. It shows that we're not alone, and we're particularly not alone in our region. There's a lot of countries who are increasingly seeing the world the same way we are and increasingly have shared interests and values with us.
Well, you're right to say that what Australia has been saying and what Japan has been saying for that matter has been sober and sensible. But there's been another person criticising Australia's rhetoric, saying Australia needs to use more nuance, and that's the Premier of Western Australia, Mark McGowan. What do you make of his interventions?
The first words that came out of Mark McGowan's mouth in that radio interview was, "I don't understand." And I think he really could have left it there because I think it was a very true statement. He doesn't understand. He's a state premier. He is not briefed on these matters. He is not expert in these matters. And my view is all state premiers, Premier McGowan included, should restrict themselves to their constitutional responsibilities, focus on those, and leave foreign policy and national security for the federal government, which has the expertise and the insight and the evidence and the material that we need to make the decisions in the national interest that we do.
Back to the bigger picture then, and on the eve of the G7, especially when you look at what's happening in the South China Sea and with wolf warrior diplomacy, when you look at what's just happened in the Middle East and what Iran has been up to there, when you look at the way that Russia has annexed other countries on its fringes, with all those issues around, Joe Biden has turned up in the UK in the last 24 hours and said that the biggest threat to global security is climate change. Does that worry you?
It's certainly not my assessment of the biggest threat to global security. Climate change is an important issue, and I understand why it's important to the Biden administration. It's important to our government too, and we're taking measured, sensible steps to address it. But I think there are greater threats to global peace, prosperity and stability. And I think rising authoritarian powers who are trying to change the world order are a greater threat than climate change. To the credit of the Biden administration, though, it has been incredibly supportive of Australia. As I mentioned, they've called out the economic coercion against Australia, and they've been very vocal about a number of issues that we are concerned about, such as the disputed islands in the South China Sea, which have been militarised by the Chinese government, such as the oppression the Chinese government has been taking out against minorities like Uyghurs and people of Hong Kong and others. So I think we're very much on the same page on security issues in the Indo-Pacific with the Biden administration.
Well, speaking of climate change, it's brass monkey weather in Canberra. I hope you get home to Victoria soon.
Thanks, Chris.